In 1766, Queen Charlotte's physicians vetted a Hampshire mother of four named Frances Muttlebury, checked her body like livestock at auction, and handed her the royal baby. Her reward was £200 a year for life, a fortune for a working woman of her era. But the real story is not her salary. It is what she and thousands of women just like her were expected to do to earn it. Number 6 on this list cost some of these women their own children while they nursed someone else's. Number 1 was a business model that modern law calls a criminal enterprise. These were not scandals whispered about and hidden. They were standard practice, taught mother to daughter, recommended by physicians, and paid for by the wealthiest families in England without a second thought. Subscribe now, because what these women did to newborns for a living would end careers, marriages, and freedom today. Number 10, dozing babies into silence. Georgian and Regency nurses kept a brown bottle on hand for exactly one purpose: stopping a baby from crying. Godfrey's cordial mixed opium with treacle, water, and spice, and it worked so well that nurses nicknamed it quietness. A single Manchester druggist later admitted selling half a gallon of the real product and up to 6 gallons of a cheaper knockoff every single week, almost entirely to women minding other people's children. The opium never mixed evenly through the syrup. So, the last spoonful in the bottle could carry a fatal dose without anyone noticing until the baby stopped breathing. Children like 13-month-old Robin Parkins died within the hour after a neighbor fetched pure laudanum on his mother's instruction. Nurses were not sneaking this. Doctors recommended it for teething, colic, and fussiness. A modern caregiver who gave an infant opium to keep it quiet would face manslaughter charges. Not a good reference. Number 9, the fingernail test. Before a nurse was hired, a drop of her milk went onto a fingernail so a physician or the lady of the house could judge its thickness, color, and taste. Milk that spread gently and tasted faintly sweet passed. Watery milk or anything with a salty edge failed her on the spot. No appeal, no second sample. This test traced straight back to ancient medical writers who insisted the best milk carried a faint almond flavor, and it survived almost unchanged for well over 1,000 years into Georgian nurseries, alongside physical inspections of a candidate's teeth, breasts, and general health by hired surgeons before she ever touched the child. Some households sent a physician to examine her the way a farmer might examine a cow before purchase, checking the firmness of her body and asking about her marriage and her menstrual history. Frances Muttlebury went through exactly this gauntlet before Buckingham House would let her near a princess, personally vetted by the royal governess and then examined again by the Queen's own surgeon. Try subjecting a modern job applicant to a bodily fluid taste test and a physical exam of her chest before an interview, and you are looking at a lawsuit, not a hire. Number 8, forfeiting her own bed. Employers believed, with total confidence, that sex or a new pregnancy would spoil a nurse's milk and endanger the baby in her care. So, contracts and household rules restricted a nursing woman's relationship with her own husband for the length of her employment, sometimes a year or more, and dismissed her immediately if she conceived. Her body was rented, and the rental agreement covered organs the family had no legal claim to under any modern employment code. A contemporary employer who tried to regulate an employee's sex life as a condition of the job would be violating labor law in virtually every developed country on Earth. Number 7, eating on command. A nurse's diet was not her own choice. Physicians and mistresses of the house dictated exactly what she could eat and drink, convinced that spicy food, certain vegetables, or the wrong meat would pass through her milk and sicken the infant. Some households demanded she eat plain boiled meat and bread for months. Others insisted on specific broths believed to thicken her supply. Refusal meant dismissal, since a nurse who would not comply with her diet was assumed to be poisoning the child on purpose. Controlling what an adult employee eats every single day down to the ingredient, is not a wellness program today. It is a form of coercive control that would draw the attention of employment regulators immediately. Number 6, giving away her own child. Here is the part that made the whole system work financially, and it is also the darkest number on this list. A hired nurse was almost always a woman who had recently given birth herself, and taking a paying position frequently meant handing her own newborn to someone else, often a cheaper, unpaid or barely paid minder in the countryside, sometimes for months at a stretch. Families paying top wages for a nurse wanted every drop of her milk reserved for their own child, so her baby was quietly moved out of the equation entirely. Historians studying the era found that wet nurses' own infants died at dramatically higher rates than the babies they were paid to feed, because the milk, the attention, and the medical care all flowed toward the client's child, while her own baby was left with whoever would take it cheapest. A woman quite literally traded her baby's survival odds for a wage, and everyone involved understood the trade before she signed on. Arranging for an infant to be sent away and effectively deprioritized so a caregiver could work would be treated today as neglect and child endangerment, full stop, regardless of how badly the family needed the money. Number 5, mummy wrapping infants for weeks. First pattern break. Everything so far has been about controlling the nurse's body. What is coming next is about controlling the baby's body, and it gets stranger. Georgian nurses swaddled babies in tight linen bands from shoulder to toe, sometimes with arms pinned flat against the torso, and left them bound for hours at a stretch, changed only for feeding and cleaning. The belief was that an infant's soft limbs would grow crooked without the support, so total immobility was treated as protection rather than restraint. Babies sometimes stayed wrapped so long their skin chafed raw underneath the linen. Modern pediatric guidance allows loose swaddling of the torso, specifically because it must leave the hips free to move, and any wrap that pins the arms flat or restricts joints for extended periods is flagged as a restraint risk today, not a parenting technique. A nurse who bound an infant's limbs immobile for hours on end now would be reported, not praised. Number 4, alcohol as medicine. Beer, gin, and porter were standard nursery supplies, given to nurses to supposedly boost their milk supply, and given directly to fussy infants to settle their stomachs or numb teething pain. A finger dipped in gin and rubbed on aching gums was considered ordinary household wisdom, not a red flag, and a spoonful of warm porter was sometimes worked into a baby's evening feed to help it sleep through the night. Doctors of the period rarely objected, since alcohol was viewed as a tonic rather than a toxin, useful for a weak constitution and harmless in small doses. A nurse who refused to use it might have been seen as stubborn or withholding a proven remedy from a suffering child rather than protecting that child from harm. Any adult who gave an infant alcohol today, for teething or anything else, would be reported for child abuse within the hour, and a caregiver who did it as routine practice would likely lose custody of children in her own care. Number 3, taking the blame no matter what. If a baby died while in a nurse's care, from illness, from an overdose of quietness, from rolling over onto the child during a shared bed at night, the nurse bore the responsibility regardless of the actual cause or her intent. She could be dismissed without pay, blacklisted from future work, or in the worst cases, hauled before a coroner, while employers who had specifically requested the opium dosing or approved the arrangement faced no consequence at all. The legal and social system of the time had no real concept of shared liability between employer and hired caregiver. It simply assigned blame to whoever's hands the baby died in. Modern law investigates cause, intent, and negligence separately for every party involved, which is precisely why this kind of automatic scapegoating would never hold up in a courtroom today. Second pattern break. The final 2 numbers are not about individual acts, they are about how the entire hiring system worked, and it is uglier than anything so far. Number 2, hiring by superstition. Families chose nurses based on hair color, complexion, and even temperament, convinced that physical and moral traits passed directly from the nurse into the baby through her milk. A calm, fair-haired woman with good teeth was preferred over a candidate judged bad-tempered or dark-complexioned, not because of any measurable difference in her milk, but because of what people believed her appearance said about her character. One American physician later summed up the era's attitude by describing wet nurses as barely human, closer to livestock than to the families who employed them. This was hiring discrimination based on physical appearance and unproven folk belief, codified as standard practice across the wealthiest households in the country. A modern employer who rejected a candidate for a caregiving job because of her hair color or complexion would be committing outright discrimination under employment law, not exercising careful judgment. And finally, number 1, running an unlicensed nursery for profit. In the poorest corners of Georgian and Regency England, some women took in multiple infants at once for a fee, nursing and minding several babies simultaneously with no medical oversight, no health inspections, and no limit on how many children one woman could take on. Parents who could not afford a live-in nurse or a wage of £200 a year paid a fraction of that to hand their newborn over entirely, sometimes never checking on the child again until it was old enough to be weaned and returned or not returned at all. These informal arrangements operated entirely on reputation and word of mouth, and infant mortality inside them ran far higher than in single-family placements, since one woman simply could not feed, clean, and watch several babies at once without something slipping through the cracks. When a child died, it was quietly buried and rarely investigated, because there was no registry tracking how many infants had passed through that one woman's care that year, and no authority whose job it was to ask. Operating an unlicensed group childcare business with no health inspections, no staff ratios, no reporting requirements, and no way to trace repeated infant deaths back to one operator is not a historical curiosity. It is the exact definition of the unlicensed daycare operations that modern child protective services shut down and prosecute the moment they are discovered, and it would carry manslaughter charges for every preventable death on the books. Every single one of these 10 practices was normal. Doctors recommended them. Mothers paid for them. Nobody thought twice because there was no alternative and no one keeping score. The Georgian nursery ran on opium, superstition, and the quiet sacrifice of poor women's own children, dressed up as devoted service to the rich. We like to imagine history as gentler and simpler than the present. The wet nurse's job says otherwise. Tell me in the comments which number shocked you most, and if you want the follow-up on what happened to the nurse's own abandoned children, say so below, because that story is even darker than this one.